library itself, real life, which is just so great, and first event in however long, and out there in the wonderful world of Zoom. And we're so lucky to have, for this re-entry to reality, Patrick Radden Keefe here at our library to talk about his epic history of the Sackler family and its central role in the opioid crisis, Empire of Pain. And we are really grateful to him for taking the time out from his brutally busy schedule to do so. It's just a huge gift to us. So really, thank you, Patrick. So Patrick Keefe has, in a very short time in writer career terms, established himself as one of the handful of truly great investigative reporters and narrative nonfiction writers in this country. I worked at his publisher, Doubleday, during this time, and it was really something to watch him soar into the Empyrean with such speed and sureness. He's the author of 4 books, including a really harrowing and powerful account of an IRA assassination, Say Nothing, that put him on the bestseller list. Empire of Pain began as an eye-opening and really blood-boiling article about the Sackler family in the New Yorker, where he's a staff writer. That article he has then expanded into this epic history of an American dynasty, and one could argue the most destructive and heinous example of corporate malfeasance in American history. And that's a story that is still unfolding. It's a great book. His editor at Doubleday, my friend Bill Thomas, who chooses his comparisons and his words carefully, as editors do, compared Empire of Pain to Robert Caro's masterpiece, The Power Broker, and in our world, there's just no higher praise. We are just as lucky to have our neighbor, Katie Rosman, here to be in conversation with Patrick. She is herself a master reporter for the New York Times. As lately, she's just been killing it. Yoga and Peloton studio moguls and big time influencers and Real Housewives of Beverly Hills quake when she calls. She is herself an author of a memoir, If You Knew Susie. This is a very special event. I just want to say one thing to the people in the Zoom world. This will take about 45 minutes or so. There will be time for questions from the floor. If you have questions at your homes, just send them in Zoom on either the Q&A function or chat, and we will monitor and we'll try to get them over. So I will turn it over to Patrick and Katie.
Thank you, Jerry, so much. And this is so great to be in the library and with people and with you. And I need to like fangirl for a second. I mean, your book is even more, it's really groundbreaking, incredible. I listened and read at the same time, which I was so glad that I had. This is like key to the whole thing, the family tree. But really, it's just it's important. It's an important book and riveting, and those things don't always go together in tandem. So we really appreciate your being here with us to talk about it. So, so I guess let's start. Like, how did you get into this? I mean, I know it started as a magazine piece, but how did the assignment start? How did your interest start?
Yeah, I mean, I should say, first of all, thank you, Katie, for doing this. It's great to meet you and great to be with all of you. I've never been to Tuxedo Park before. Jerry drove me around earlier, and it's quite a place. So this is a
I
real...
sold him a house.
Yeah, exactly. He was in full real estate broker. But this is a real treat, and I'm glad to be with you all. So it started as a piece in the New Yorker in 2017, and at that point, I did not break the news that that there's this company, Purdue Pharma in Connecticut, that produced this drug, OxyContin, which many people believe played a really key role in helping precipitate the opioid crisis, this terrible public health crisis that has killed more than 500,000 Americans. And that the company was owned by this family, the Sackler family, that it was a privately held company, entirely owned by this wealthy dynasty that was more familiar to people, I think, as a philanthropic dynasty. So if you go to the Met, there's the Sackler Wing, and there's a Sackler Center at the Guggenheim, and you start seeing the name everywhere. So that was not a secret in 2017. They'd been written about a little bit in the New York Times. There had been a couple of books about the opioid crisis where there were a few chapters about the Sacklers. But I wonder if you have this experience too as a writer. Sometimes for me as a reader, I have my reader brain and my writer brain, and they can sometimes be sort of having an argument, a kind of meta conversation as I'm reading something. And so when I would read these books about the opioid crisis, they would tell multiple different stories. You'd be following doctors and patients and criminals and investigators, and then you get a little bit about the Sacklers, and then they would move on. And my reaction was to say, "Well, wait, don't leave that family. They're so fascinating. Come back to that. I want more." And there was that, and then there was just I was sort of struck by the fact that they had this great fortune, which had been derived from this drug that had caused so much misery, but it didn't seem to have caught up with them. Like when they moved through the world, people didn't seem to be asking them hard questions about that. And that seems strange to me. So I proposed a piece in the New Yorker, which would do something that hadn't been done up to that point, which was, we're just going to focus just on the family. This won't be about the opioid crisis. Broadly speaking, it'll be a very close look at the family and the role that they played. And so the piece was assigned, and I spent the better part of a year working on it.
Wow. And did you know it would be a book when you were, to work for a year on something?
I didn't. No, in fact, I was pretty sure it wouldn't be a book, because I should be clear that the family didn't cooperate with me. They didn't want to talk with me, and that's for some journalists, I think that's often they won't write a piece if they don't get access to the person at the center of it. For me, that's almost an invitation. I like writing pieces about people who won't cooperate. I think it forces you to be creative, and so that piece was a long piece. I don't remember how long, something like 12 or 13,000 words, but in which I didn't have access. And I felt as though it worked just fine as a piece. But at the time, I thought I couldn't turn this into a book, because what I worried about was that if I did it as a book, they wouldn't cooperate with me. The family company was privately held, so there were no documents I could get hold of. I just worried that it would feel like you were looking at the family through a telescope. And I think you can do that in a magazine piece, and people will be all right with it, where they don't feel that they really come to kind of intimately understand the people that it's about. But that if I were to do a book, I wanted it to have a kind of almost novelistic immediacy, where you felt like you were really coming to know these people as characters. And in 2017, I didn't think that was possible. So actually at the time, I sort of affirmatively decided there will not be a book.
But you did manage. It does feel very intimate, and that's at least how I read it. You feel like you get to know these people and their motives and their insecurities and their ambitions.
I hope so. That was certainly the ambition, and a few things changed after that decision, where the first was that there were some lawsuits that produced a lot of documentation and discovery. So suddenly there were thousands of pages of internal documents that I could get access to, internal emails, so you could actually see the way they talked behind closed doors. And then the other thing that sometimes happens, I think for newspaper reporters and magazine reporters alike, is that sometimes you work on a story and the world doesn't know you're working on the story, and you're trying to think of all the people you'd like to talk to, and you come up with your lists and you're calling people, and maybe they get back to you, maybe they don't. And then you publish. And then as soon as you publish and it's out there in the New York Times and the New Yorker, people start getting in touch with you and saying, oh, I noticed you're interested in this. Well, I have a story to say about this and the other. And for me, often the experience is like, where were you 3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
You know, where were you when I needed you and could use you? And in this case, after the piece came out, there were a series of people from the Sacklers' world, people who'd worked for them, people who knew them socially, a college roommate, you know, former friends, who got in touch with me. And so suddenly there was an opportunity, I thought, to tell a story that would feel a bit more vivid.
Okay. All right, so I want to talk about a few elements in the book that just were, I mean, there was a lot that was surprising, but let's start with the fact that Arthur Sackler, so there's these three brothers, but Arthur primarily, well, he wasn't primarily anything because he was a doctor and an ad man, but he was an ad man. I mean, that was really what he was doing. And then he had these two agencies where there was a little bit of, you know, a lot of secrecy going on. Can you paint a bit of a picture of Arthur professionally in that day?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the big choices for the book was to spend, the book is about 3 generations of this family. It's not really an opioid crisis book. It's more of a kind of multi-generational family saga. And the first section focuses, a third of the book focuses on this guy, Arthur Sackler, who dies in 1987. He dies before OxyContin is ever introduced. And there are a few reasons for that. But one of them was just that I thought he was such a compelling character. I mean, you don't, when you write nonfiction, I feel like it's almost like found art. You don't, you know, you can't make these people up. You have to kind of go out there and just do the spade work and see what the world gives you. And Arthur is just one of these, to me, he feels like a character for the ages. He feels like he could have walked out of a Saul Bellow novel. He was this amazing, charismatic, protean, brilliant guy who, as you said, was a physician, a psychiatrist, did, you know, some groundbreaking research, but was also really interested in marketing and how you sell drugs, and then also in medical publishing. And so he's got not one, but 2 medical advertising firms that ostensibly the whole world thinks that these 2 firms are the 2 rival pharmaceutical advertising firms, but secretly he has a hand in his own rival. Makes his first great fortune marketing Valium, starts a medical publishing company and a newspaper for doctors that has all these articles about how pharmaceuticals are so great, and carries ads from his advertising agency for drugs that he has an interest in. He's collecting art and collecting wives, and just sort of, he had this kind of crazy, expansive approach. And I think a sense that becomes very important later on, it was almost as if he gravitated to conflicts of interest. He was constantly taking things that probably should be separate and trying to find ways to make them mingle.
It's a great way to put it. I mean, this is like just a detail, but I was like, oh my God, the most unbelievable thing, he's cheating on his second wife with his first wife. You know, yeah. Sort of like right. He right. Just the indignity yeah. Of Marietta. But it does sort of get to that. And so there's this really amazing scene that I think helps pull a lot of this together, because the ad stuff is really important, because ultimately the opioid crisis is a result of a marketing success. You know, it didn't exactly. Just happen. It very much was, it wasn't the drug, it was the marketing of the drug, really. But so there's this scene in the book that felt really important to me, where Arthur is he's testifying before Congress related to an FDA conflict. I mean, it's so unbelievable in a way. Will you lay it out a bit?
I can try. I mean, it's so complicated.
Yeah.
And this was, I think, in some ways the hardest chapter in the book to write, because there was just so much going on. But so Arthur had all these different interests, and there was a guy named Henry Welch who was the head of antibiotics at the FDA. This is in the 1950s. And so very powerful figure in the world of drugs who gets to approve what drugs can be sold and how. And it turned out that Henry Welch was corrupt, and he'd been corrupted by industry. And it happened in this kind of crazy way where Welch was the co-editor of these two journals, and a job that he managed somehow to have while having his government job. And then the journals would print reprints, and they would sell the reprints. And the pharmaceutical industry would buy up the reprints, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of copies of the reprints. And this was a way to funnel money.
Because the writer would get a cut.
Because he would get a cut of the reprints. And so there's this whole kind of emerging conspiracy. And there was a very powerful Senate investigation going on. The Senate investigator who had previously gone after the mob, and now he's going after big pharma. And what was amazing is I got all the files. There are 40 boxes at the National Archives, files of this investigation, and you can feel them when you see the documents. They can just kind of squint and see Arthur Sackler behind it all, that they're trying to prove that he's the guy pulling the strings. And they're saying, well, his accountant is the accountant for all these other people, and the guy who was the paymaster is his best friend, but they're never able to completely connect him. And the scene that you're talking about is Arthur gets summoned to testify, and he comes in, and it's this kind of command performance where you would think it would be intimidating for him. There's this panel of senators grilling him about his business, but he comes in and he just absolutely runs the table. He kind of filibusters them, he lectures them, he patronizes them, he keeps correcting the little mistakes they make. And he had this very powerful lawyer, Clark Clifford, who was kind of I don't even know who you would analogize with today, but he was the power lawyer of his day in Washington, who had pre-negotiated a set amount of time that Arthur was willing to testify. So he just comes in and does this amazing performance, and then drops the mic and walks off before they can lay a finger on him.
Yeah, it's sort of in today's argot, he mansplains them in a way, and then it's just like, I'm sure I've answered all your questions.
Right,
so
done.
Yeah, and it really, none of it should be surprising to any of us, but the degree to which the government, regulators were, just completely on the dole, on the take. And then the FDA, of course, then there comes in a second conflict that's very significant. We can come to that, but I want to talk about a couple other themes. I think the art is really important because it washes the family, and yet he also has the Met by the balls, and pardon the expression. And there's just he needs the imprimatur of being an art collector, but the way the museums need him, and that's just a whole nother system that you really reveal so powerfully. Can you tell us about that also?
Yeah, I mean, so the context in which I knew the Sackler name before I started working on this book was that this was this philanthropic family who'd given hundreds of millions of dollars away to universities and to art museums and to medical research, and you see their name everywhere. And a lot of what I was trying to do in the book was try and understand the origins of that, why it is and how it is that they developed this kind of mania for giving money away, always with the condition that their name be on it. And it really starts with Arthur in the 50s. As soon as he starts making money, he starts collecting art, and he's doing it with a sort of frenzy. He's collecting left and right, and it gets to a point where, in the account of his second wife, he starts buying so much art that all that matters is the moment of acquisition. She likens it to kind of sexual conquest, basically, that he sees an object or learns about it, and then he must have it, and if he has to outbid other people, he will. And as soon as he has it, he loses interest in it, and starts looking for the next thing. And it gets to the point where the crates are arriving at the home more quickly than they can open them up. And they don't even open up all of the crates to sort of handle the objects, and thousands of art objects are filling up the house, and he needs more storage, and he ends up getting storage at the Met, a secret storage space at the Met that they give him, with the kind of, because he dangles the idea that if they give him these perks, someday he'll leave his great collection to the museum. Spoiler, he does not. I mean, one of the things that was really revealing for me was seeing the, I don't want to sound naive, but I feel as though from the outside, you hear about somebody making a $20 million commitment to an art museum, and it sounds like just a kind of purely benevolent act. And getting into the archives of the Smithsonian and the archives of Columbia University, which was actually the first recipient of their philanthropy, you see this much different picture, which is that, as you said, I mean, a lot of the time the university or the museum is kind of getting pushed around, and they feel they're desperate for whatever generosity they can get, but they're making all of these crazy concessions. And a lot of the time, because of the tax advantages of the philanthropy, you have these situations in which the donor is actually making money out of the deal, and yet they're willing to do all this stuff. And it's weird. I went to Columbia. I first moved to New York to go to Columbia for college, and this is pre-COVID. I was in the rare books library at Columbia, going through all these old interoffice memos, and you get these kind of pathetic moments where the provost of Columbia is writing to Arthur Sackler and saying, "I notice your client Pfizer has moved into new offices, and does that mean there's any furniture from their old offices that they don't need anymore? Because here at Columbia, we could really use any hand-me-down furniture that Pfizer might have." And you realize that when Arthur, makes demands, he does so because it's this kind of, I don't know, it's almost a kind of predatory relationship.
It's very transactional.
Yeah, highly.
Yeah. And then you've got Philippe de Montebello, who sort of is, comes off as this like regal guy who knows what his currency is, and his currency is cultural credibility, class acceptance as a part of the, highbrow, brilliant, if it's the New York Magazine metric,
Yeah.
and he's just, he wants the art, but he can't he doesn't grovel, and he loses.
He's not going to grovel. And it's funny because you end up with this kind of personality clash. So Arthur for years had enjoyed a relationship with the Met where they would give him all kinds of crazy concessions. But part of what was fueling Arthur, I think, is that he was a kid from Brooklyn whose parents didn't speak English when they came to this country, and who grew up poor against the backdrop of the Depression, and who wanted in. This was a guy who, as a high school student at Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn, he had a job delivering flowers on the Upper East Side, and he would see these apartments. He would see this world that was kind of close enough to touch. And so I think so much of what he's doing culturally is, I want to put my name on the building. I want to kind of buy my way in with my own good taste and my stellar collection and the money that I'm throwing around. But he always suspected that he didn't belong and that he was being excluded. And then to have Philippe de Montebello essentially kind of reinforce that insecurity and say, "I see right through you. You're an Arabiste. You don't belong here. There's something grubby about you." It creates this pretty fierce clash of wills.
Yeah. And I just wrote a piece about this podcast about the Steinberg family, the Saul Steinberg family. And there's a line where the Steinbergs also Jewish. I think they're one generation removed from immigrants, but Saul buys the Rockefeller apartment in 740 Park, and that what the family would say is about sort of the ruling elite, and it was very divided by religion, was all lineage but no dough. And it is sort of, Arthur comes in with the money and can't be turned away because of it, but can't quite leverage it for all that for all that he wants. And so it really is this generational story, because then, and I don't mean to skip over Raymond and Mortimer, as I'm sure they often felt, but so then we get to the second generation where, you know, Richard really sort of dominates, and he, as you describe it in the book, and his college roommate, and you know, a lot of amazing sources sort of paint a picture of this generational shift where you're raised with money. And so sort of like set the table with Richard a bit.
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't read the book, the what you would find in the handy family tree is Richard Sackler, who kind of moves into center stage at the beginning of the second part of the book, is Arthur Sackler's nephew. He's the son of Arthur's youngest brother, Raymond. And you have this family business that Arthur bought for his two brothers, basically Purdue, at the time known as Purdue Frederick, which started in Greenwich Village. He purchased it in 1952. And Richard is Raymond's son. He grows up in great wealth in this great big house on Field Point Circle in Greenwich, overlooking Long Island Sound. He becomes a physician. He has I think a kind of charisma may not be quite the right word. He's a weird guy, but he has a sort of headlong enthusiasm. He has a sense of excitement about his own ideas, and I think a kind of intellectual arrogance, where, you know, if he comes up with any notion, he wants to pursue it full force, and he ends up kind of rising up within the family business, Purdue, and overseeing this transition in which the company goes from a profitable but kind of sleepy family pharmaceutical company that mostly produced over-the-counter drugs, you know, an earwax remover, a laxative, that sort of thing. They transition into pain management in the late 70s, early 80s. At the time where pain management as a field and sort of field of study is on the rise. Yeah, so it's kind of perfect timing, because there's a reevaluation happening in American medicine and British medicine, which essentially says we have left people to suffer from untreated pain. We need to be more aggressive in treating pain. And as this is happening, Purdue moves into pain drugs, and specifically opioid pain drugs, so drugs that are derived from the opium poppy. So, okay, I want to stay on Richard, because that's really where we get to OxyContin. And there's, you know, you learn, if you haven't read the book, you must. And there's so much about, you know, this patent cliff and trying to beat a clock, and they're willing to make their own drugs obsolete to introduce newer ones, and just the general idea that they're trying to give morphine a better name. You know, that they're saying, you know, morphine, people think of it as dying, a drug for the dying. We got to sort of like rebrand, make it more approachable, change the personality. Mm-hmm. Is it Friedman, Richard Friedman? Michael Friedman. Michael Friedman. Yeah. So Michael Friedman's this marketing guy who's working very closely with Richard, and they come up with this idea that is really like very sinister in its brilliance, which is, let's not market our new drug as being like incredibly powerful and the most powerful pain, you know, killer. Let's say like it's very middle of the road. It's for, you know, we're going to get approved for cancer pain, but really it can exist for just, you know, like sort of quotidian sort of stuff. So tell us a bit about that, because that's where we get into what is now the opioid crisis. Yeah. Right? From that decision, I mean, that right. Strategy. Yeah, I mean, this is the big pivot. So initially, Purdue has this drug called OxyContin, which is a morphine pill, and it's a big success for the company, and it's a cancer pain drug. And at a certain point, the patent on that is running out, and so they're thinking, well, what do we do next? How do we follow this up? And they decide that they're going to take the same slow release coating that they had on the morphine pill, find another opioid to put in there, and in this case, it's oxycodone, which is a stronger opioid. And the idea was you could come up with a drug, a pill that has these really huge doses. So 80 milligrams, 160 milligrams of pure oxycodone in a pill. And if it has this slow release coating, it'll just slowly filter out into your bloodstream over the course of 12 hours. And you can sleep through the night. You only need to take 2 every 24 hours. The pivot is that when they're developing this idea, they say, you know, the problem with MS-Contin was, while it was hugely successful and made hundreds of millions of dollars a year, there's only so many people who have cancer pain. Wouldn't it be great if we could position this new drug not as like the nuclear solution you keep on the top shelf for the people who are in the worst shape, but as something that is really kind of for everyone? It's for moderate pain in addition to severe pain. They estimated that that market could be, you know, 40 million people who might potentially make use of such a drug. And so they had this problem, right, which is that OxyContin was actually much stronger than MS-Contin. Oxycodone is much stronger than morphine. But they realized that doctors didn't know that. The doctors actually believed that it was weaker. This was a kind of a mistake that they discovered in their focus groups, as doctors didn't know. And there were these incredible emails that I found when I was working on the book, where these executives at high levels of the company say, whatever we do, we can't let the doctors figure out that they're wrong about the product that we're selling, that it's actually stronger. Because if we did that, then they'd be much less likely to prescribe it to all the sorts of people we're hoping that they prescribe it to. We don't want it to be niched for cancer. We want this to be much more successful than that. And so there's this campaign to argue that this new opioid, OxyContin, is first of all, you know, not dangerously strong, but also not addictive. That it's addictive less than 1% of the time. That was their claim. So you had and this is really where the opioid crisis kicks off, is you had an American medical establishment that was reluctant to prescribe these drugs to just anyone because of a fear that they might be addictive. And the company sets out to change the mind of American doctors, and they succeed.
And they get a line in their literature that the FDA approves that says only in 1% has it become addictive.
Well, so they get a line, they get a crazy line in the package insert that says that slow release coating is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug, which is, when you look at it now, is kind of an insane little piece of language. Is believed?
By who?
By who? You know, how seriously should you take that if you read that on the side of a bottle? And that was approved by the FDA.
And there's the FDA says that the company put it in, and the company says maybe the FDA put it. I mean, it's like a failure of regulation beyond.
So afterwards, when there's a huge scandal over this line and it ends up getting taken out, nobody can agree on who wrote it. So it's like a secret line that slipped into the package insert on a drug that became the biggest blockbuster drug of its day, and nobody will say who composed that line. But they also sent out their marketing teams, and they all said explicitly that that OxyContin was addictive less than 1% of the time. And
and then another key figure I wanted to ask you about is this lawyer Udell, Howard Udell. Mm-hmm. So he becomes a very important figure, and in fact tries to, you know, I think very fittingly tries to patent technology that makes email disappear and become untraceable. But tell, you know, I guess what I'm trying to focus in on, and what was just part of the brilliance of your book, is just all, you know, you see the marketing guy and the lawyer and the sales force, and tell us about this lawyer, because he's a really good character. I mean, it sounds like a horrible person, but
yeah. You know. Well, I was interested in these people around the Sacklers and the kind of, you know, before I became a journalist, I went to law school and you know, took the New York bar, and so I think a lot about lawyers and the kind of mercenary qualities that some lawyers have. And Howard Udell was this person who was just very, very loyal to the family. He had started working with them decades earlier. He spent about 4 decades working for the family. And he was really ruthless and cutthroat, and he believed that the Sacklers could do no wrong. One lawyer who dealt with him made a comparison to me, compared him to Tom Hagen in The Godfather, you know, the kind of family consigliere who will do anything for the family. And yeah, you know, there's this kind of interesting moment, right, where they put the drug out in the world, argue that it's not addictive and won't be abused, and then almost immediately the world starts telling them, oh, you're wrong about that, because people start abusing it and overdosing and getting addicted and dying. And to me, this is one of the really interesting kind of moments, because just imagine if you had a business that was suddenly generating billions of dollars a year, selling a product, but you were getting reports that lots of people were dying using the product, that kids were dying. I think it's just an interesting question to ask yourself about how you would deal with it as an individual or as a family or as a business. And what Udell and others did was they basically said, they kind of went into a defensive crouch, and they said, we are not going to slow down one jot. This is not our fault. We're going to go full speed ahead. And when people, you know, tried to blow the whistle, among them a former New York Times reporter, and write about this stuff, what Udell would do is, rather than listen to the message and say, hey, we should think hard about what we're doing here, maybe, you know, we wouldn't want to be complicit in death, he would try and kill the messenger again and again and again.
And sort of have this attitude of, if we show sympathy, if we admit even the smallest possibility that there's any truth to any of this, like, the gig is up.
Totally.
And in fact, it's interesting. One of these things that like seems obvious in retrospect is that the labeling on the package that said, if you break this up, it will release, you know, is what taught people how to abuse it.
Yeah. I mean, I should say, I don't think that was, you know, I don't think that was deliberate. Some people argue that, but I don't think it was cynical, but yes, so you have this control release coding around an 80 milligram dose of oxycodone, and then on the package it says, whatever you do, don't crush the pill, because if you do, you'll get 80 milligrams of oxycodone right away. You know, for some people, and I should say, some of these people are teenagers who stole it from their parents' medicine cabinet, or just looking to party. But some of it is also people who got surgery and were given a prescription for OxyContin afterwards, and found that they started needing it and going into withdrawal when they didn't have it, and taking it more often than they were supposed to be. And what they learned was, if you need the full effect right away, you crush the pill, you chew the pill, you snort the pill. So it's, we haven't touched on this, but it's important that the way the company and the family respond when they start hearing that people are dying is they say, oh, well, that's not the problem with the drug. It's the problem of these drug abusers, that these are kind of, you know, reckless, morally questionable, addictive types who, if they weren't abusing OxyContin, they'd be abusing something else. And so it's kind of a guns don't kill people, people kill people argument. You know, the product is not the problem. It's these problematic people. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about the demographic. And clearly the opioid crisis has spared no demographic, but there, you know, there is a demographic that emerges as really, you know, the most vulnerable, or very visibly vulnerable. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days, even inside Purdue Pharma, amazingly, people referred to OxyContin as hillbilly heroin, and there was a sense that the impact initially was felt in white working class areas, rural areas, post-industrial areas, Maine, kind of along, you know, along the Appalachians. That was where you first started to see indications that there was a real problem. And it's interesting. I mean, I think that specific demographic led to, I think there's all kinds of interesting implications there. I mean, to some extent, it meant that maybe the problem persisted for a while longer because these were communities that had kind of been forgotten by the country. I think the notion that these were like reckless pill poppers was easier to sustain because it was those types of communities. But at the same time, these people were white. And, these days when we talk about, when I talk about people who are addicted to opioids, I talk about them as victims. And I think that's a good improvement in the way in which we talk about addiction in this country. But I've certainly had many conversations with people who say, where was all this victim talk during the crack epidemic in the 80s? When the people were Black, they weren't being described as victims. So the sort of demography plays interesting roles here.
Yeah, I never really focused in on that, but it's 100% true. There's sort of whose responsibility is the addiction. And then you just sort of really, the brutality of the crisis is, laid bare. How was that to report on?
I mean, it's not easy talking to parents who lost children. And there's kind of no getting around it, and it doesn't ever get easier. You have to do it. And I made a kind of particular narrative choice in this book not to, I sort of focus on the perpetrators more than the victims, but that doesn't mean there aren't victims in the book. I made a decision that I didn't want to have there's a convention in books about the opioid crisis, which is that it's like, you meet a young woman and she's a cheerleader and life is going great. And then you go away for a while and then you come back to her and she's been injured and she goes and gets surgery and gets a prescription, and then you go away and you come back to her for a while and things aren't, and there's a kind of narrative predictability in the way in which those types of stories are serviced, I think, sometimes. And so what I wanted to do was not stay with any one victim or set of victims for too long, but instead you never get very far in the book without seeing them. You just encounter people. And what I wanted to do was have them not be random people I was reaching for, where it's like suddenly we go to Ohio. Instead it's, my character who's a sales rep goes to call on a doctor one day who prescribes a lot of OxyContin, and she's upset. And he asks why, and she says it's because a relative of hers has just died from an overdose. The legal secretary who sits outside Howard Udell's door at Purdue Pharma headquarters becomes addicted to OxyContin and gets fired when she's addicted. And it's literally a woman who sits on the floor where all the Sacklers sit in the building. There's a young guy who works on the property of Mortimer Sackler Jr. in Amagansett, who becomes addicted to OxyContin and is on the Sackler property in a van snorting OxyContin pills. So what I wanted to do was tell those stories, but in these kind of vignettes where you would see that there's nothing remote about this. The Sacklers might want to think that they're moving through the world and not seeing the impact of the drug, but in fact, it's all around them.
I want to give people a chance to ask questions. So I'll ask a final thing, which is skipping a lot. And my apologies to me and everybody. But so where are we now? Like, has the book changed anything? I mean, the book it had a very big impact on the culture. It was very well read, incredibly well reviewed, received. Has it had an impact, do you think?
I mean, I think it's too soon to say, and it's hard because I very strongly identify as a journalist and not an activist, and so I'm not actually sitting down with a series of objectives. What I want to do is kind of put the truth between two covers, and this is a story about a family that has obfuscated the truth for so long that for me it's enough just that the book exists as a physical thing in the world, and that it'll be there for people who want to engage with this story. The Sacklers this has all kind of ended up in bankruptcy court, and the Sacklers have agreed recently to pay $4.5 billion to help remediate the opioid crisis while also denying any wrongdoing. Ask yourself if you would pay $4.5 billion if you felt you'd done nothing wrong. And the thing, I'll tell you, the one thing I've got my eye on is the Metropolitan Museum of Art has announced that they are, as we speak, deliberating about whether or not the Sackler wing at the Met should continue to be called the Sackler wing at the Met. And I was interested, the Met Gala, big ball that they have every year, happened a few weeks ago. And there was an interview in Time magazine with the head of the Met, and he was asked this question. And he said he didn't give any indication one way or the other how he'll come down, but he did say they're going to decide, within the next few months what they'll do. And then he volunteered. He wasn't asked about it. He volunteered. He said, "I've been reading this great book, Empire of Pain," which I thought was so who knows where he'll come down, but I'm glad to think that that he's reading.
Well, as you know, as hopefully everybody here and virtually here, is it's just, really, I mean, it's riveting and engrossing. It's not homework. It's hard to put down, and yet you will learn an incredible amount. So highly recommend. But let's give everybody or anyone a chance to ask questions. Maureen.
Oh, I chumped Jerry. That's great. So, were there any characters or any characters in the Sackler family that you felt were sympathetic characters? I mean, you were kind of light on Raymond versus Arthur, or even Mortimer. But were there any in the first generation, second generation, or third generation from your research that you felt were more sympathetic than others?
I mean, to be honest, I feel some sympathy for, at times I feel sympathy for all of them. And Arthur in particular, I mean, sometimes you're seduced by your subjects. And I think Arthur's a very seductive guy in some ways. I think he ends up doing some terrible things, and I don't really ultimately buy what he's selling. But I can't help but admire the kind of, the sale.
There were clearly brilliant, right? I mean, his marketing strategy, business strategy was admirable. It's like, if he put his genius to good,
Totally.
Evil,
Yes.
that would make him more sympathetic. Obviously.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing I think about is there's that line, Steve Jobs apparently used to talk about how some people put a dent in the universe, right? And there's no question that Arthur Sackler and then ultimately the subsequent generations put a dent in the universe. The argument we would have is like, is it a good dent or a bad dent? And I think they think it's a good dent. I think it's a pretty terrible one when you net it all out. There were various figures. I thought a lot about Madeleine Sackler. For those of you who haven't read the book, this is a third generation Sackler who's a filmmaker and makes quite good films and is interested in big issues like mass incarceration. And I thought a lot about how to present her story because her position is essentially, I have nothing to do with this. I don't know why I would be associated with it. I've never worked for the company. My position is, if you're worth tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, and that money comes from the sale of OxyContin, it doesn't matter that you're not on the board of the company. You do have something to do with it. You don't have as much to do with it as Richard Sackler does, but it's just silly to suggest that, this money appears in a trust in my benefit. And I don't ask any questions about where it comes from or what it means. So she was one where, I really kind of tried to see it from her point of view, but there's only so much I can sympathize with there.
Can I just ask a follow-up question about the dents in the universe? Mm-hmm. You were talking about Arthur, but the dents in the universe of whether it's good or bad, of the Sackler family. I mean, I guess my question is, or statement I should say, is that, you talked earlier about products and people and their view that it wasn't the product, it was the people. I think that where it is someplace in between that, because the product of OxyContin is not a terrible product, right? It's still used today. Mm-hmm. I mean, frankly, I've got recent stories where I think it's oversubscribed, but that's a different story. But it's not the product itself that was a problem, which they invented, basically. It's the marketing. It's the first to start with and stay with kind of mentality. That's where the whole opioid crisis started, is how they marketed the product, right? Not the product itself. It's not the product. It's the marketing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, except that I think the one place where I would push back is OxyContin is potentially quite addictive. For a lot of people, it is. To say otherwise is just a lie. So the issue there was that they, to this day, as of a few months ago, when their attorneys responded to questions that I sent through, they claim that it is vanishingly rare for a pain patient who is prescribed OxyContin by a doctor and takes the pills as instructed to become addicted to the drug. They maintain that that's the case to this day. And that's just wildly wrong. Like, it's hundreds of thousands of people have experienced that, and they kind of talk it away and say, so it's hard. I agree with you, it's the marketing. I'm not suggesting that the drug should not have been invented or should be pulled from the shelves, but I do think that for them to say it's not the drug, the implication is the drug is actually not addictive. It's really all on the user. And I think that is to obscure the fact that the drug can be addictive, even when you take it just as the doctor ordered.
So let me just follow up on that last thing, and I promise. Can I just finish that one? Because my son, this is an interesting tidbit about prescribing medicine. My son just had an appendectomy, an emergency appendectomy. They prescribed him OxyContin. The doctor's note to them said, it is not addictive. This is what it said in the notes. Please take this. Pain management is key. It is not addictive if you take it as prescribed. So that's an interesting.
Wow. All right, let's get someone else next. Sir?
thing.
Yep. Go ahead.
Could you give some stats, like you said, Appalachia, on how that market was flooded so much? And maybe even name the states and give some stats on the deaths that this drug caused?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the stats at my fingertips. I can tell you that there was absolutely a marketing push in some of those states, driven in part by looking at where are the doctors who are likely to prescribe a lot of this drug. That's where we want to focus our marketing energy. And so looking at regions in which you have a lot of people who work tough manual labor jobs, a lot of people who maybe have injuries sustained on the job, people who suffer from chronic pain, and physicians who are likely to prescribe a lot of painkillers. There's a fascinating study, and I'm not going to do it justice here, but in the final chapter of my book, I talk about it in some length. There's an amazing study about how there were a handful of states, I think 5 states, where there were state level restrictions that made it more difficult for doctors to prescribe opioids. They were called triplicate states, because when you filled out a form, you had to do it in triplicate, and you had to file a form, copy with the state and with the medical board. And Purdue made a very deliberate decision back in the mid-1990s to not push the drug as hard in those states, because the sense was we're not going to get as much of a return on investment in terms of our marketing. Here's the crazy thing. Overdoses in those states, these states are all very different. So there's like big states, small states, they're from different parts of the country. The economies are different. There's nothing else they have in common except for the fact that they were these states where Purdue decided to push less. Overdoses have been lower in those states over the last 25 years. And this would be true for OxyContin and other prescription opioids. And the crazy thing is eventually the opioid crisis shifts to heroin and to fentanyl, right? But a lot of those people are people who started out on prescription drugs. The craziest thing is, a quarter of a century later, overdoses due to heroin and fentanyl are lower in those 5 states where Purdue did less marketing for OxyContin back in the mid-1990s. So it's pretty wild the degree to which and this is a serious academic study that was recently published, in which a bunch of economists kind of crunched the numbers, but in which you can kind of look at this correlation between the marketing push back in the 1990s and then overdoses and deaths, not just associated with OxyContin, but with other drugs as well.
It created this long-term consumer
Market, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Jerry?
So I wanted to congratulate you on your Saul Bellow comparison for Arthur Sackler, which just leads me to think of the Bellow characters like Augie March or Henderson who want. It set my mind racing, and then you were talking about Arthur Sackler buying and buying and buying and buying, and my mind jumped over to this William Randolph Hearst documentary that was on television, who did the exact same thing. And I thought, why didn't you call this Citizen Sackler after all? This seems like such an American story. It doesn't seem like this could happen in any other country in the world in just this way. And I wonder if you talk about how American it is and what makes it so American.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that, because to me, that was part of the allure of the story, is that it's a story about the American dream. You know, it's this, there are these, Arthur Sackler, when he's a teenager, he goes to Erasmus High School, and there's this big statue of Erasmus out there, and there are the names. A number of the founding fathers had been instrumental in helping finance this particular high school, which dated back to the Dutch era. And their names are kind of etched in glass and etched in stone. And so he's this young kid wearing the same suit, threadbare suit every day, growing up surrounded by these names, and the idea that there's a kind of continuity. There are these people who came before, who left their mark on the country, and that all these thousands of kids at Erasmus have that same opportunity. To me, that's what's so extraordinary, was the idea, and I think it's kind of a beautiful idea. It's the dent in the universe idea, right? But the idea that within the span of a single generation, you could rise to the heights, you could change the world in the way that that Arthur certainly does, and I think his brothers and the others who follow do. And to me, that is quite an American notion. When Arthur dies, he's I don't know, he's worth probably $250 million, and he's friends with the great and the good, and his best friend is Linus Pauling, and he's close with the Pope, and John Paul, and who's John? I think it was John Paul, yeah. And Ed Koch speaks at his funeral service in the Sackler wing at the Met. It's that idea of ambition and what it can achieve. But then, to me, the flip side of that is that it's a story about how a great fortune corrupts everything. So internally, it can corrupt the family itself, but then the private money generated by the Sacklers ends up corrupting the Department of Justice, the Food and Drug Administration, any number of state and federal legislators. And it's a kind of soft corruption, right? It's not me sliding you a suitcase full of money. It's the guy who approved OxyContin at the FDA, approving the drug, and then leaving the FDA and going to work at Purdue Pharma for 3 times his government salary. That's not illegal, but it's pretty corrupt, in my view.
Yes.
We have a question online.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Have you heard from the Sacklers or any players featured in the book since publication, or what have you heard has been their response?
So, yeah, it's been funny. The Sacklers have been threatening to sue me since before I started writing the book. So mostly I hear from their lawyers and their PR hatchet people. And they had gone pretty quiet since the book came out. So I was getting legal threats right up into the end. And then they went pretty quiet. They may yet sue me. I'd be naive not to consider that a possibility, but the book is there's like 100 pages of notes at the end, and the truth is a great defense in those types of lawsuits. So I think it would be a mistake for them to do that. Yeah, I've heard funny stories from various people. I mean, it's not clear to me that anybody in the family is really reading the book. They might be. If they are, they're not admitting it. One of the villains, kind of unlikely villains of this story, who you meet, she's the first person you meet in the book, is Mary Jo White, the former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. She was the head of the SEC under Barack Obama, longtime lawyer for the Sacklers in Purdue, and just an absolute hatchet woman for the family, who I think has really, in my view, compromised what was otherwise a great and stellar legal career. And I did get a note from somebody who lives in her building, and apparently was in the elevator with her and said, "So I've been reading this book." And Mary Jo White primly informed him that her memory of events differs from mine. So,
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure. All right, last, yeah.
So, the notion of corrupt or conflicted business practice is, I think, really built in the first section, and then sort of continued throughout the Purdue phase, even though Arthur himself wasn't really involved in it. And so I was curious, like from a process perspective, where and how in the research or the article or the book writing did you realize that contextual and familial continuity?
Oh man, what a great question. My colleague Jane Mayer wrote a great book about the Koch brothers, but really it's about two of the Koch brothers. I mean, there are two other brothers, but they're not involved in politics and money in quite the same way. Me reaching for Arthur was not because he was the wacky uncle with a great story. It was that I felt as though in his story you could find the seeds of so much that would come later, and that was kind of that was something I realized pretty early on. And as I started to structure the book, I really thought the big decision was, do you want to devote a third of the book to this guy who dies? But my feeling was he kind of creates the world and the language and the toolbox. And so I knew that intuitively early on, and I had some evidence for it. The thing that was helpful and kind of affirming for me was that the more spade work I did, the more evidence of that I found. And so if you've read the book, you know that there are these kind of, it's almost as if everything happens twice. I mean, I try not to hang too much of a flag on it, but there's stuff that happens with the development of Thorazine leading into Valium that then looks a lot like what happens with MS-Contin leading into OxyContin. There's these kind of pivots, the way in which they use lawyers, the way in which they evade investigations. So I was really struck by that. I think the key for me from a process point of view was, and this was generally true for the book, just not to put too much spin on the ball. I mean, just to let the story tell itself, and not, one of my least favorite things as a reader is when I feel as though, or the writer keeps like double underlining stuff just in case I missed the irony, So I hope that that stuff speaks for itself.
All right, let's one more.
I had heard that doctors were given perks for prescribing OxyContin. Is there any truth to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was and I get into this at some length in the book, but there was a whole juggernaut of persuasion in which you would have doctors, they set up a speakers bureau in which they would hire doctors to talk to other doctors about pain management and opioids. And there were actually thousands of doctors who got paid to give speeches to other doctors about how great these drugs were. Those speeches would often happen at these all expenses paid junkets. Fly down to a resort for a weekend. We'll talk to you a little bit about pain management, have a steak dinner. If you know doctors, a lot of the time what they'll tell you, certainly some of the doctors in my life have said this to me, is they'll say, oh, we know the pharma companies spend all that money, but I would never be influenced by that sort of thing. Nobody's going to change the way I prescribe by buying me a steak dinner. But there have been studies on this and that show that, for as little as like a $15 lunch, you can change the way a doctor prescribes. And one of my favorite statistics in the book is that some years Purdue Pharma spent $9 million a year just to buy food for doctors. And I can promise you that if they weren't changing the way the doctors were prescribing and they couldn't show that they were getting a good return on investment on that money, they would not be spending that much money to buy doctors' meals.
Well, this has just been fantastic. Thank you so, so much, really. And thank you for bringing us together and talking about something important, but also, like I said, just a really riveting read. But it says a lot about the world we live in, and I think it impacts all of our communities in all sorts of ways. So thank you, really, truly.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you all.